When the doors of the Commonwealth Summit opened, no one expected the king to stand before the world and declare Catherine as his successor. What drove this unimaginable abdication? The truth begins here. The air was heavy with anticipation as the grand hall of the Commonwealth Summit buzzed with dignitaries, cameras, and whispers of diplomacy. Flashes from journalists' cameras cut through the tension as leaders from across the globe gathered, expecting another routine speech by the monarch. Yet, when Charles stepped onto the stage, something was unmistakably wrong. His pallor betrayed a man carrying the weight of something too monumental to hide. Even his closest allies, seated in the front row, leaned forward, their expressions betraying confusion and concern. He adjusted the microphone with shaking hands, his eyes scanning the room as though searching for someone to rescue him from the words he was about to utter. In the front row, Catherine sat beside William, both of them frozen in place, their shoulders stiff, hands clasped tighter than the world could see. Their eyes met briefly, a fleeting moment of silent panic. Then came the words that would not just ripple through the hall but across every corner of the globe. Catherine will lead. The proclamation seemed to hang in the air, almost impossible to absorb. Gasps echoed through the crowd, a collective intake of breath so sharp it silenced the rustling papers and clicking pens. Journalists shot to their feet, cameras flashing wildly, as though eager to capture the impossible declaration from every angle. Catherine's expression froze somewhere between shock and disbelief, while William's jaw tightened in an attempt to mask his own unease. For a moment, the room itself seemed to hesitate, trapped between awe and chaos. The media immediately scrambled, reporters whispering to one another, furiously tapping at their devices, speculating if the statement was symbolic, ceremonial, or an unprecedented reality. How could this be? Why Catherine and not the natural heir? As the murmur grew louder, one could almost feel the foundations of the monarchy tremble under the weight of the revelation. And yet, amidst the confusion, whispers among the royal aides began to surface, barely audible, yet searing enough to shift the atmosphere. This was no spontaneous, emotional outburst from the king. No rash decision brought on by fatigue or sentiment. Those who had been closest to the palace corridors all along insisted this was a calculated move, weeks, perhaps months in the making. Because this was not merely an abdication, it was the unveiling of a plan crafted in shadows, born out of secrets and betrayals no one outside those walls dared to imagine. But behind this shocking proclamation lies a trail of secrets, betrayals, and quiet maneuvering no one dared imagine. For years, Charles carried a burden heavier than his crown, a personal struggle that few noticed but that quietly consumed him. The months leading up to the Commonwealth Summit were marked by a slow unraveling of the man beneath the crown. His public appearances became increasingly strained, the confidence that once anchored his speeches replaced with a peculiar hesitancy. Observers whispered about his exhaustion, not just in his face but in the way his hands trembled when he raised a glass, the way his words faltered mid-sentence, as though he had lost faith in them before they even left his mouth. Behind the facade of duty, cracks were beginning to show, and those closest to him began to see the truth. Inside sources revealed a string of heated arguments echoing through the palace corridors. Discussions about the future of the monarchy that once were polite, debates evolved into sharp, cutting battles. Charles clung to his right to rule, yet his advisors grew more restless, daring to suggest what no one else would say aloud, that the kingdom deserved a stronger figure, a fresher face. The name Catherine surfaced more often than he could bear, her popularity a silent dagger twisting in his pride. His distress deepened as private doctors' visits became more frequent. Disguised as routine consultations, they were anything but. Behind closed doors, whispers of his failing health circulated, a body worn thin by decades of relentless duty and suppressed turmoil. And with each confidential report, he grew more isolated. Even Camilla, once his closest confidant, began withdrawing from him, retreating into her own quiet sanctuaries. The once shared intimacy dissolved into silence, her absence leaving a bitter emptiness in its place. What haunted him most, however, was something neither doctor nor advisor could remedy. The shadow of Diana. Her ghost still loomed over his reign, her memory sanctified in the public's eyes, casting his every move in her unforgiving light. And now Catherine, graceful, beloved, impossible to ignore, only compounded his torment. In her, he saw everything he was not, adored, untouchable, untarnished. Confidantes later described nights when the king would sit alone in his chambers, scribbling feverishly into his diaries, his pen tearing into paper with words of doubt and fear. Some of those pages, they say, revealed his deepest terror that history would remember him not as a king who ruled with wisdom, but as a man who surrendered everything under the crushing weight of his own inadequacy. And as Charles's resolve crumbled, another figure quietly rose in the shadows, preparing to take the crown in ways no one expected. Long before the summit, Catherine was already being groomed, not by choice, but by circumstance and quiet determination. Her ascent began softly, almost invisibly, yet it unfolded with the inevitability of destiny. Across the Commonwealth, she had come to embody a quiet kind of royalty that people could actually believe in. They called her the People's Princess, a phrase once reserved for Diana, but now whispered with a reverence that even her critics could not fully deny. Crowds gravitated toward her warmth, her ability to speak without condescension, to listen without distraction. The young mothers saw themselves in her, the elders saw a gracious future in her. She never demanded this devotion, but it arrived all the same. Whispers persisted that even Queen Elizabeth, in her final years, had taken Catherine aside for private conversations no one else was privy to. Those who claimed to have overheard snippets swore that the Queen spoke of leadership, of the crown's future, and of the people's trust words that carried an almost prophetic weight in hindsight. Some suggested the Queen had seen in Catherine what she wished she had been in her youth. Unshakable yet empathetic, regal yet human. And though nothing was written, and nothing was confirmed, the Queen's quiet favor left an indelible mark that others began to notice and to fear. Catherine's mastery of diplomacy became undeniable. In receptions, she moved through heads of state and tribal elders alike, with a grace that even the most seasoned envoys failed to match. Behind closed doors, she could diffuse tensions between feuding nations, or resolve a protocol nightmare before it spilled into scandal. She did this not with ostentation, but with charm sharpened by resilience. Without ever saying so, she began to outshine not only Camilla, but even Charles himself. And the courtiers noticed. Within the palace, staff slowly shifted their loyalties. They began to see in her not just a princess, but the very embodiment of what the crown needed to survive a cynical age. Camilla's temper, Charles's fatigue, neither inspired the kind of confidence Catherine did. Even long-serving attendants who had once sworn fealty to the king began quietly ensuring Catherine's path was clear of obstacles. Their quiet allegiance only emboldened her resolve, though she never asked for it. Time and again, she rose above the crises that seemed determined to break her. When scandals threatened the family, it was she who found the words to soothe a nation's anger. When tensions among the royals flared into cold wars, it was she who restored fragile civility. Each victory sparked admiration, and, just as sharply, envy. For while the world cheered her, some within those palace walls began to see her grace not as an asset but as a threat. Yet beneath her calm surface, Catherine nursed her own private doubts. In the solitude of her chambers, she wondered if she was truly meant to lead or merely playing a part written by others. She carried the burden quietly, knowing she could never afford to let it show. But while Catherine navigated the delicate politics of the monarchy, forces were gathering against her in the shadows. Not everyone wanted Catherine to ascend. In fact, some of the most powerful figures in the Commonwealth plotted to block her rise at all costs. The declaration at the summit may have stunned the world, but for weeks, perhaps longer, there were whispers of resistance gathering in quiet corners of power. Certain member nations, already skeptical of Britain's dominance, feared Catherine's reign would tighten London's grip over their sovereignty. To them, she symbolized not progress, but a return to a kind of royal paternalism they had fought to escape. These doubts did not remain polite disagreements. They hardened into strategy. Leaked letters, slipped into the hands of a journalist with more courage than sense, revealed a series of backroom deals struck among key Commonwealth leaders. Meetings held in private suites, hushed phone calls at odd hours, coded memos, delivered by trusted aides. Together, they sought to build a coalition, backing an alternative figure, someone pliant enough to respect their autonomy, but powerful enough to challenge Catherine's inevitable claim. The public never saw these maneuvers, but inside Buckingham Palace, their shadows were felt in every corridor. Among the documents uncovered was one particularly chilling artifact, the so-called Summit document, drafted weeks before the abdication and buried under layers of bureaucratic secrecy. The text, terse yet scathing, outlined an unprecedented plan to formally question Catherine's suitability, citing her lack of sovereign experience and alleged favoritism toward British interests. Its existence became an unspoken threatened invisible sword hanging above her as she prepared for the summit. What unfolded in the days just before the announcement only deepened the tension. Meetings between Catherine and foreign dignitaries grew strained. Smiles cracked under the weight of unspoken accusations, and conversations laced with ceremonial niceties throbbed with challenge. Several high-ranking officials directly questioned her vision, implying she lacked the backbone to command a fractured Commonwealth. One even went so far as to warn her she might wear the crown but lose the kingdom. Worse still were the anonymous threats that began arriving at her private residence. Notes written in clipped, formal language that nonetheless chilled her blood. Some warned her to step aside or risk chaos. Others alluded cryptically to secrets the world was not yet ready to hear. Security tightened around her, but the message was clear: her path was no longer hers alone. And in a cruel twist, whispers began to circulate that even some of Charles's closest advisors were stoking the flames. Convinced his reign could still be salvaged, they worked behind the scenes to deepen the divisions and convince him the Commonwealth would never accept Catherine. Their aim was to trap him into staying, to make Catherine's rise seem reckless and dangerous. Yet the pressure that was meant to preserve his throne only hastened his downfall. As opposition mounted, an explosive event pushed Charles to abandon his throne faster than anyone could anticipate. On the eve of the summit, a devastating scandal surfaced, one that could have destroyed the monarchy if left unchecked. It began with whispers that quickly turned into shouts. A whistleblower, whose identity remains shrouded in mystery to this day, stepped forward with damning evidence, tying the king's private charities to gross financial mismanagement. Funds meant for humanitarian efforts had inexplicably disappeared into a labyrinth of shell accounts. What made the revelations explosive wasn't merely the money, it was the suggestion that the king himself had approved some of the transactions, signing documents that now served as a noose around his own neck. Even as palace officials scrambled to respond, another blow landed. A series of tabloid reports began circulating, alleging that Charles had deliberately buried damaging information about Camilla's family business, a network of offshore deals designed to avoid scrutiny. The papers painted a portrait of complicity, of a monarch not just compromised but actively working to protect private interests, while the public's faith in him withered. The timing of the leak was no accident. Someone, somewhere, had planned this storm to break precisely when he was most vulnerable. But nothing could prepare the palace or the world for what came next. A private recording emerged, broadcast across networks like a hammer falling on marble. In the muffled audio, Charles could be heard confessing, in a rare moment of unguarded despair, that he regretted ever becoming king. The words were heavy with bitterness, the tone unmistakably defeated, and the reaction immediate. Protesters gathered at the gates of Buckingham Palace within hours, their chants a mixture of rage and betrayal. Inside, chaos reigned. Staff raced through corridors, shredding memos, issuing statements, desperately trying to contain a narrative spinning far beyond their control. The phone lines never stopped ringing. Every call brought another demand, another accusation, another threat. Catherine, already walking a precarious tightrope, was summoned into emergency meetings. Though she bore no responsibility for any of the misdeeds, she became the monarchy's only hope of salvaging its reputation. Advisors looked to her not just for damage control but for survival. The final blow came behind closed doors when Charles was confronted with an ultimatum. Step down now, or face complete and public ruin. There would be no quiet rehabilitation, no gradual retreat from public view. The choice was his, but the outcome had already been written in the eyes of those around him. The king had become a liability too dangerous to keep. And so, with his back against the wall, Charles made a fateful decision that would change the monarchy forever. In a scene that felt more like a funeral than a coronation, Charles relinquished his crown, and Catherine stepped into destiny. The hours before the announcement were charged with a silence so heavy it suffocated every room it touched. Behind the grand walls of the summit venue, the family gathered in private, the air thick with words no one dared speak aloud. Catherine stood at the center of it all, poised yet visibly burdened, while William's clenched fists betrayed the storm inside him. Charles himself appeared hollowed out, his eyes red-rimmed and distant, as though he were already a ghost haunting his own reign. He addressed his family first, his voice low but deliberate. acknowledging the failures that had led him to this moment. Tears welled but did not fall as he admitted he could no longer bear the weight of a crown that had become more punishment than privilege. In Catherine, he said, he saw redemption not just for himself, but for the monarchy. He confessed he had fought her rise out of fear, rather than conviction, and now it was fear he was surrendering to fear of what would happen if he didn't let go. The words of abdication, when finally spoken aloud, carried the solemnity of centuries of royal tradition, yet still landed like a thunderclap on modern ears. The language invoked ancient oaths, the relinquishing of God's anointed burden, and the passing of it to one more worthy. Those in the room knew it was ceremonial, but to hear Charles name Catherine as his successor, with full authority, stripped bare centuries of rigid protocol in one stroke. When it came time for Catherine to step forward, her face remained solemn, almost unreadable, but the faintest tremor in her hands betrayed the enormity of what was happening. She accepted the responsibility publicly, her words measured but unwavering. She vowed to serve with humility and strength, her tone carrying both the gravity of the moment and a quiet defiance toward all who had doubted her. William stood just behind her, his face caught between pride and apprehension. He was proud, yes, but fear glimmered in his eyes, fear of what the crown might do to her, of how it might consume her as it had consumed his father, and yet he stayed silent, his presence a quiet affirmation of her new role even as his heart roiled with conflict. Outside the summit hall, the world reacted instantly. The crowd erupted in a cacophony of cheers and gasps, a strange blend of jubilation and disbelief. Some chanted her name with fervor, while others simply stood in stunned silence, grappling with the idea that the monarchy had been reshaped before their very eyes. Yet, even as the world celebrated Catherine's rise, hidden battles still raged within the palace walls. Behind every crown lies a family torn apart, and Catherine's unexpected coronation brought long-simmering resentments to the surface. No sooner had the crowd outside the summit erupted than the first crack appeared. Across the ocean, Harry and Meghan issued a statement so scathing it sent shockwaves through every level of the royal apparatus. Calling the transition an affront to the principles of democracy and decency, they accused the palace of orchestrating a silent coup, one that placed personal ambition above the good of the people. The words were sharp, calculated to wound, and left no doubt as to where they stood. For Catherine, it was a bitter betrayal not because it was unexpected, but because it came so quickly, so publicly, and with such venom. Meanwhile, Camilla disappeared entirely from view. Within hours of Charles's abdication, she retreated to a private estate, locking herself away from reporters, from the public, and most tellingly, from Catherine. Those who attempted to reach her were met with silence. Behind closed doors, aides admitted she refused even to speak Catherine's name, her absence speaking louder than any words could. She had lost her place, and she could not forgive the woman who now stood where she once imagined herself. Even Princess Anne, long regarded as the family's quiet backbone, could not contain her fury. Reports from palace insiders revealed she stormed out of a family meeting, visibly livid at being overlooked despite her seniority, her decades of service dismissed without acknowledgement. To her, it wasn't merely about titles or protocol, it was about respect, something she now believed the crown had denied her in favor of a younger, less experienced figure. And William, always so composed in public, struggled in private. Those close to him described his late-night confessions of fear, his voice cracking as he admitted he worried Catherine was being used as a pawn in someone else's game. He stood beside her during ceremonies, but the doubt lingered in his eyes, a constant question he could not bring himself to ask her outright. Within the palace walls, the tension seeped into the staff itself. Those who had once worked seamlessly together began choosing sides, their loyalties pulled between old allegiances and the new order. Conversations grew curt. Instructions were ignored or deliberately delayed. What had once been an ironclad household now rattled with suspicion and quiet rebellion. Old grievances that had lain dormant for years re-emerged, reignited by Catherine's unexpected rise. Long-forgotten slights, bruised egos, and broken promises clashed with the demands of a crown already strained to its limits. The monarchy, held together by formality and illusion, was fracturing from within, and Catherine stood at the center of it all. Her every move scrutinized, her every word weighed, and yet, as darkness gathered at home, Catherine faced her greatest test on the global stage. With the crown on her head, Catherine now bore the weight of a world waiting to see if she could deliver what Charles never could. Her first address as monarch came just hours after the abdication, and it was nothing short of extraordinary. Standing before the world, her voice carried neither arrogance nor apology, but a quiet resolve, and a grace that instantly set her apart. She spoke of the enormity of the responsibility she was assuming, and of her unshakable commitment to serve not just as a figurehead, but as a true bridge between the past and the future. There was no falter, no hesitation, only an unflinching honesty that left even her harshest critics momentarily silent. In her speech, Catherine called for unity across the Commonwealth, acknowledging the pain and wounds of the past that had yet to fully heal. She spoke of partnerships rather than dominion, promising to listen where the monarchy had once spoken too loudly, and to act where it had once stood still. Her words struck deep, signaling to the nations watching that this would not be a continuation of Charles's reign, but something entirely new, something daring. The press wasted no time crowning her as a beacon of modern leadership. Headlines heralded her as the monarch the world had been waiting for, the woman who could mend what others had broken. And yet, among the glowing praise, doubt lingered. Skeptics pointed out her lack of political experience, warning that her charm would not be enough to navigate the cold realities of power. Some quietly predicted she would be overwhelmed, undone by the very forces that had once propelled her forward. But Catherine wasted no time proving them wrong. In her first days, she made a series of deliberate, symbolic gestures to communities long marginalized by the crown. Her visits to forgotten boroughs, her meetings with indigenous leaders, her acknowledgement of histories the palace had once sought to erase. Each act was a statement, not of pity, but of solidarity. People began to believe that, perhaps this time, the words from the throne might finally match its deeds. Behind the scenes, she engaged in backdoor negotiations with dissenting Commonwealth nations to keep them aligned, offering concessions and assurances others would never have dared. More than once, her advisors warned her she was giving away too much. But Catherine understood something they did not: that keeping the Commonwealth intact required more than authority, it required trust. And yet, even in her quiet moments, the cost of her triumph weighed heavily. She would steal away, if only for a moment, to breathe and remember everything she had surrendered to stand where she stood: her privacy, her peace, her innocence. The crown, she knew now, was not a prize but a sacrifice. But just as she seemed to command the throne, whispers of a deeper betrayal threatened to unravel everything.